another use of the term ideological, which I'm just calling the sociological view. Okay. What do I mean by that? Well, from this point of view, ideology is that set of social, political, and moral values, attitudes, outlooks, and beliefs that shape a social group's interpretation of the world. It's that whole complex set of ideas, political and moral values, attitudes, outlooks, beliefs that shape the way a group sees the world. But ideology is a term to describe that kind of nexus that helps us understand the world. So from this point of view, ideology is the framework within which we make sense of the world. Everyone has an ideology, or maybe a set of ideologies, plural. From this point of view, ideology is not something that you have and I don't, not something that's an impediment to you that I have transcended. Ideology is a term to describe the fact that we all look at the world through some lens, some set of ideas that help us understand that world. And there are competing ideologies. I mean, just think of this. Take one of the most simple and obvious examples. There are religious ideologies and secular ideologies. Ideologies that fundamentally say if you want to understand the world, you have to understand it through a set of religious ideas, maybe ideas about the divine. Right? Then there's a secular ideology that says, no, you understand the world not through the religious or the supernatural or the divine, but you understand it through the material world. Okay? Those are two different ideologies. Right? So, in this use of the term, ideology is not an insult that you use to suggest someone else is confused. It's a recognition that we all have an ideology. And the assumption behind this is simply that there is no neutral inquiry into the social world. That if you want to understand the world, there is no view from above. You can't take yourself out of the world to understand the world. You're always in the world. And the way you understand it is always being shaped by the ideology you bring into it. So I'm calling this the sociological view because it highlights our place in a social group. Notice that I'm not framing this as an individual thing, that you have your ideology, you have your... Our ideologies tend to come out of the social groups of which we are a part. Right? That if you actually ask people to detail their ideology, that is, if you asked people, to detail every part of that set of social, political, moral values, that no two would be exactly alike, but that most of the way we see the world comes out of the social groups that we are part of. So the focus here is on the way we all operate in the world and recognizing that we are all part of social groups and that is important to us. Okay. Now, I want to take a break from this for a second and go to an articulation of this. I don't want to just suggest you should always understand the world because I said so. It does happen to be the case that I am right almost all the time, but we want to have a little backup. So I thought I'd play a little clip of it's actually a very famous moment between Alan Greenspan and a U.S. congressman named Henry Waxman. Okay, so let's figure out who these folks are. Who's Alan Greenspan? Anybody? Former chairman of the Federal Reserve. That's an important position, people. Who's the current chairman of the Federal Reserve? Ben Bernanke. This should all be at the tips of your tongues. The Federal Reserve Chair is an important person. Who voted for Ben Bernanke in the last election for Federal Reserve Chair? How many of you voted for Ben Bernanke? Nobody? How many of you voted for his opponent? Why is this a stupid question? He's an appointed position. Nobody votes for. One of the most powerful people in the country, maybe you could say one of the most powerful people in the world, the Federal Reserve Chair, has a lot to do with policy around your money. Yes? Big stuff, yes? Alan Greenspan, longtime chair of the Federal Reserve, controversial chair of the Federal Reserve, right? Was chair of the Federal Reserve in the period leading up to the financial meltdown of 2008. I mean, Alan Greenspan had a lot to do with the way the world is playing out right now. But it's one of those it's presented as kind of a technical, policy, wonky kind of job. It's all about figuring out interest rates and monetary issues. Who knows anything about that? All right, so the Federal Reserve Chair is a very important position, but one that people often don't think about a lot. All right. When the financial crisis came, there were congressional hearings. Congressional hearings about important things are not uncommon. This was the Congressional Committee for Oversight and Government Reform. It's chaired by Henry Waxman, who's a Democrat from the state of California. He's been in Congress a long time, and he's known as sort of a gadfly, somebody who likes to ask impertinent questions of people in power. This is a short clip from a 2008 congressional hearing in which Henry Waxman is questioning Alan Greenspan about how it came to be that the U.S. financial system went into free fall, subprime lending crisis, recession, you know, the world that we live in today. So let's listen to a couple minutes of this.
Mr. Greenspan, you had an ideology. You had a belief that that free, competitive, and this is your statement, I do have an ideology. My judgment is that free, competitive markets are by far the unrivaled way to organize economies. We've tried regulation, none meaningfully worked. That was your quote. You had the authority to prevent irresponsible lending practices that led to the subprime mortgage crisis. You were advised to do so by many others, and now our whole economy is paying its price. Do you feel that your ideology push you to make decisions that you wish you had not made?
Well, remember that what an ideology is a conceptual framework with the way people deal with reality. Everyone has one. You have to exist, you need an ideology. The question is whether it is accurate or not. And what I'm saying to you is, yes, I found a flaw. I don't know how significant or permanent it is, but I've been very distressed by that fact. But if I may I just finish an answer to the question previously?
You found a flaw in the reality?
A flaw in the model that I perceived is the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works, so to speak.
In other words, you found that your view of the world, your ideology was not right. It was not working.
Precisely. No, that's precisely the reason I was shocked, because I've been going for 40 years or more with very considerable evidence that it was working exceptionally well.
That's Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan and I, take my word for it, probably agree on very little about the world. Alan Greenspan's politics and my politics are wide apart, but we do agree on one thing. You heard him articulate it. Everybody has an ideology. He's using the term ideology in this sociological sense. That he called it a conceptual framework. He was using different words, but he was trying to say the same thing. Okay? Now, Henry Waxman is saying that you've been quoted, Professor Greenspan, as having observed a flaw in your ideology. So, tell me about this. And you notice Alan Greenspan is very distressed. He's worried that somehow the way he saw the world led to the collapse of the American economy. I'd be distressed too if I thought the way I saw the world led to the collapse of the American economy. All right. So Alan Greenspan is saying we all have this conceptual framework. And he's saying, and I think very accurately, he said the question isn't whether you have an ideology or not. You all have one. The question is whose is the most accurate at helping us understand and predict reality, because that's what you want to do. An ideology is supposed to help you understand the world, and we would hope be able to, in what limited ways we can, predict the direction the world is going. That's what you want an ideology for, to deepen your ability to understand. So he says, I think accurately, the question isn't ideology or not, it's whose ideology is better. And he's saying that he found a flaw in his ideology, his model for how an economy worked. We're not going to go into detail, but the ideological framework that Greenspan and many others worked in was the notion that the market is always best. Right? The idea that markets are self-regulating, self-correcting, that whenever possible, let markets do their work, and that government regulation is always a bad thing from that point of view. That's his ideology he's talking about. And he's saying that, well, it looks like maybe that ideology wasn't 100% accurate. So debating whether or not one is more of a free marketeer or leans toward government regulation, I think that that's a very good summary of this second sociological view of ideology. That everybody's got one, and we want to be clear about them so that we can evaluate how well our ideologies serve us, and serve us toward the goal of deepening our understanding of the world.